Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from the What is Money show. And as you've learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to facilitate financial security for all. They accomplish this by bringing a high level of professionalization and sophistication to the Bitcoin marketplace. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. By using NYDIG, you will gain access to an end-to-end institutional-grade platform, providing Bitcoin OTC transactions, Bitcoin collateralized borrowing, secure custody, asset management, derivatives, financing, market research, and more. And all of these services meet the highest regulatory, governance, and audit standards. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and is leading the way for ongoing institutional adoption in this nascent asset class. So please be sure to check out NYDIG as a single source for all your Bitcoin needs. Brent Johnson, welcome to the What is Money show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
It's great to have you. We got to meet in person in Miami. Sitting on George Gammon's panel at the Rebel Capitalist show. We talked about the history and future of money. And I think today, what we're going to try to get into, general themes at least, are similar. I'm going to look at kind of the history and nature, possibly the future of money, its relationship with violence and the state. And then you just mentioned to me, you read my good friend Nick Batia's book, Layered Money. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
And for the audience, so Brent is the founder of Santiago Capital, which is a wealth management firm. He's a prolific thinker in the sphere of capital, finance, money, macro. And I guess I'll let you speak to where you stand on Bitcoin. You're definitely, you just mentioned to me before the show that you're free market leaning, but maybe they don't always have the whole picture. So as another part of this conversation today, we're going to go into David Graeber's book, Debt, a little bit, which I think makes some very interesting counter arguments to the Austrian view. So Brent, welcome to the show. I'm not sure where to dive in here. There's a lot to talk about.
I have a feeling we're gonna cover a lot of ground here. I don't know if it may jump around a bit, but I know we have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it would be helpful if you wanted to start out with a little bit of brief background on yourself. That'd be great, and then we could just jump into Graeber's perspective on money. I guess that would be a good place to start, where he talks about debt versus barter and how it's evolved over time.
Sure. So maybe the best way to set this up is to, I started my career on Wall Street in '99, so a little over 20 years ago, and I did about a 6-month training program, and then I came out into quote unquote business in the winter spring of 2000. And shortly after that, the market crashed. So, I was going through the training program when the technology boom was just, full guns blazing. And I came out thinking I was going to get rich in just, a few months. And then everything kind of went the other way. And so we had a year or so of crisis. And then we had the 9/11 event and had another year or so of crisis. Then we had a couple of decent years. And then things started to kind of go south again. Then we had the global financial crisis. Mm-hmm. And then that just started to get better. And then we had the Euro crisis. I don't know if you remember the Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece. They were worried that Southern Europe was all going to go bankrupt. So we had another crisis. Then we had a couple decent years. And then we kind of started having the repo crisis and some of these other things. And then we have COVID, right? So in the last 20 years, I feel like I've had at least half the time in my career I've been in crisis, and the other half of the time it's been okay. And there's been a few good years along the way as well. And so that's a long way of saying that, I think potentially if somebody had spent 20 years from like 1980 or the early 80s to 2000s, where markets were not more calm, but just more, not maybe less irrational and less crazy, a 20-year career during that period may be a little different than the 20-year career of the last 20 years.
Right.
And I have, and I'll get into the reason why, but I believe that the last 20 years, the education, the real world education, I guess, that I got over the last 20 years, in conjunction with all the reading and the self-education that I started doing about 12 years ago, has kind of prepared me for what I think is going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I'm going to say is that a lot of times people say, oh, Brent thinks he knows this, or Brent thinks he knows this. And I do not know what's going to happen, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen. All of us are using the best of our abilities to speculate on what the future is going to bring. Absolutely. I think I have a reasonable idea of how it's going to play out, but none of this is guaranteed. So, anything I say, I always tell people to go do their own research. Think for yourself. Don't believe it just because I say it, and certainly don't believe it just because somebody else says it. Right. So I don't know if that answers your question. I just got kind of rambling there, but
that's perfect. I appreciate the context, and it sounds like you've been raised in the fires of the markets essentially, and a lot of that, at least the Austrian view, would be that increasing central bank intervention has driven larger and more frequent crises around the world, and we're going through more of it now.
That's right.
So maybe,
and, I think maybe to kind of further this, give me just 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll kind of set it up, because I think this is going to help people understand my point of view a little bit better as well. And people have heard me on other presentations or podcasts. I've talked about this kind of this very important meeting that I had in 2007 that kind of really changed my perspective on a lot of things. But even before that, in college, and even in my first 6 or 7 years in business, I was kind of one of those guys who I was just kind of smart. I always had a lot of people around me that were a lot smarter than I was, but I was smart enough that I could remember. If I took a class, I could remember what the teacher said, and I could memorize things really well, and I could get pretty good grades. Not the valedictorian or anything, but I could just kind of get by remembering stuff. And so when I took classes on finance and economics, I didn't necessarily learn it all as far as inherent knowledge. I just learned it long enough to get a good grade on the test, right? And then when I went through the training program on Wall Street, whatever the people that trained me told me, I pretty much believed them. I just took what they said as gospel. And then, I had this meeting in 2007 where I was with this young couple who had sold their company, and we were trying to convince them to put their money with us to manage. And I brought in all these experts from my firm, all the people that were kind of my idols, and the people that I looked up to, and the people that I wanted to become. And I thought, this is going to be a slam dunk. These people are going to just wow this young couple with their expertise and their knowledge. And we get into this meeting, and I realize these people don't know anything more than I do. They've just been saying the same thing all their life, and most people believe them because they don't know any better. But this young couple, they actually kind of thought for themselves, and they asked a number of what I thought, very smart and intelligent questions. Not necessarily even hard questions, just different questions that were typically asked, and these people couldn't answer them. And it made me realize that they couldn't answer them because they really didn't know. They were salespeople. They were essentially salespeople.
Yeah.
And I left that meeting very disillusioned and discouraged. And I went back to my desk, and I literally got out a piece of white paper, because they had asked a number of questions about inflation and tax rates and the amount of debt, and all these numbers, the entitlements, huge. At the time they were billions, now it's trillions, but at the time it was hundreds of billions. And so I got out a piece of white paper, and I literally did the math longhand just so I could see it. And I did kind of a back of the napkin analysis on the United States, economy and government, and it was a very stark reminder that it was not in good shape.
Right.
And so and I literally had the light bulb above the head moment, and that kind of started my period of self-discovery, where I went back and I read a bunch of the stuff that I read in college, but this time to actually understand it.
Yeah.
And, I went on blog posts, and I went to conferences, and I read textbooks and economic papers, and, I sought out people who kind of thought like I did. And that kind of led me to the Austrian school, for lack of a better word. And I really liked the Austrian school because I thought it actually made sense. A lot of the times when I would take finance classes, in college, or even learning the stuff in my first years in business, I could figure it out, again, long enough to memorize what I needed to do, but it didn't really inherently make sense to me. And then when I kind of went to the Austrian school, I kind of figured out, well, the reason it didn't make sense is because it doesn't make sense. It's all just this, crazy system that the world has built. And the Austrian school, I guess, gave me a foundation for how things should be, or how they would be in a free market. Yeah. And so that really helped me kind of understand economics from a fundamental standpoint, and money and currencies. And that was great. But then, you fast forward several years, and I started, to be honest, I started to have some problems with the Austrian school, because I thought in many ways they were just as dogmatic about their beliefs as the Keynesians were about their beliefs.
Right.
And while I appreciated the Austrian school perspective, in my opinion, the Austrian school explains how it would be in a free market. Right. And I'm a free market guy. I'm a capitalist. So that really speaks to me. But then the reality is we don't live in a free market. Yeah. And very, very, only for very short periods of time in history has there ever been a free market. There's typically some involvement from the state or local power or the government or local warlord, however you want to define that makes it not a free market. And so I think if you have the Austrian viewpoint of the free market, it may sometimes hamper your ability to act in the market as it actually is. Anyway, that all kind of, and then Bitcoin's kind of and then I lived in near Silicon Valley, and I had all these friends who were in tech. And so Bitcoin kind of enhances all of that stuff and has a technology perspective. So I just kind of feel like all of this stuff has kind of gelled together, and now, here we are with the next 5 years ahead of us. And I think all that stuff is going to be on the table.
Yeah, no, it's great color to your lens on everything. So let me ask you a couple of questions about that. One, I think maybe it'd be useful for us to define, I'll try to define free market, and feel free to correct me if you see it differently. I think the Austrians essentially define it as a forum of voluntary exchange where there is no compulsion, no threat of violence, no threat of aggression against property, effectively. And this, as I mentioned to you offline before the show, in my mind, my understanding of a pure free market gets a little cloudy in relationship to violence, because violence is something that is inherently centralizing over time. It's a necessary service. You have to actually have protection from violence to have free trade. But the protector government, the monopolist on violence, often becomes the entity that demands tribute, charges monopoly prices in terms of taxation, inflation, et cetera. They almost always monopolize the money throughout history, which is a very big problem for the free market. So maybe you could chime in on that, how you see the free market, and maybe why we have never really had one. And then if you could talk a bit about when you became acquainted with the Austrian school, were there particular thinkers or books that you gravitated towards?
Yeah. So maybe I'll answer that last question first. Is the first place I went. Well, there's a guy named Bill Bonner who has he I don't know this for sure, but I think that he is probably the biggest owner of a newsletter writing business in the world. So he himself is an author and has written several books, and then he has a number of different media companies that he owns that puts out newsletters, and some of them are geopolitical related, some of them are finance related, some of them are gold related. And so I initially read one of his books. It was called Empire of Debt. I think I read that in 2007. That was before the financial crisis, and he was kind of warning about a crisis was coming. And so that kind of opened my eyes a little bit. And then you can go down the rabbit hole pretty quickly on this stuff. And I was trying, and I kind of like that stuff anyway, kind of geopolitical conspiracy theory stuff. And you find out that a lot of the conspiracy theory ends up being conspiracy fact. Yeah. But, early on, I was trying not to go too far down that rabbit hole too quickly because I didn't want to get lost down there. Yeah. So I was trying to, and so I was also, it wasn't just going to read the news. I was trying to read other, more mainstream stuff. But but it's hard to find anything Austrian school that's mainstream. It's just inherently not mainstream.
Absolutely.
But I read a couple books by Rothbard. I went to, the Mises.org website. It's fantastic for anybody that's trying to learn. And here's my point: is even if you don't like Austrian School of Economics, but you don't know anything about it, you should read a lot about it, because it's good to know the other side's arguments, if nothing else. But the Mises.org website at the time, and I think it still is, was a great resource.
That's right.
For tons of papers and books. And, there was a book called What Has Government Done to Our Money?
Yeah.
And I read that, and that made a lot of sense. He wrote a book, was it Rothbard or Hayek? I don't know, one of them wrote The Mystery of Banking. And I thought that was fantastic. The Mystery of Banking was a really good one.
Yeah, I'm not sure who wrote that one. I don't know if I read that one.
And then, so that's the first place I would go. Is if you're interested in Austrian School of Economics, or even just another point of view, should go to the Mises.org website, because I think they have a lot of good stuff. And then I had, doing that, then I started meeting other people, and and they started sending me books and, articles and links to read. And, I read things like Jim Rogers. He wasn't necessarily an Austrian, but he was involved in the gold world. And, Jim Rickards was, he still is, but he was pretty prolific at the time writing books. And, several years ago now, my friends Ronnie Stoferle wrote a book called Investing for Austrian School Investors. So I read it. I tried to read as much as I could, really just to kind of get that. And I think it's good, because I think it does help you understand from a fundamental point of view how economies work.
Yes.
With the exception that, now we'll come back to the other part of your question, is that the state's involvement, right? There's all, for people who aren't familiar with this language, the state is just whoever the local power is. It could be a city government, it could be, a country, it could be if you're a tribe living out in the woods, whoever the biggest, strongest guy or girl that, kind of running the show, that's the state. So there's always been some kind of state intervention on some level. And maybe it's a collective agreement that everybody came to. But I don't think in history there has ever been a prolonged period of voluntary exchange, total free market. I can't sit here and say that it never existed anywhere.
Right.
But that's just typically not how history has gone. What's that called? History is the story of the conquered and the conquerors, right? And, for better or worse, people fight over resources and fight over land and fight over money. And that's kind of the history of the world. And so I always and that's why while I'm very sympathetic to the Austrian School of Economics, and I think it's really important to have that foundation, I think something gets lost if you only focus on that. Anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Lots of good points there.
Well, before I forget, sorry, I just thought of something, because you asked me about the state and violence. And I think this is something else that's important to talk about, because I think if for somebody who's not versed in all of this and they hear us talking about this, what violence are they talking about? I don't walk out in the street and get beat up every day. Well, some neighborhoods you might, right?
Yeah,
but it's not the typical experience. But the point is as long as you play by their rules, you don't, right? But you are bound by their rules, and if you don't live by their rules, there are various forms and levels of punishment that go along with that. And maybe it starts off pretty benign initially, but it can eventually land you incarcerated or dead as a result of not complying, right? And so I kind of joke and laugh about it, but it's actually very serious. The state makes the rules, and the state, to your point earlier, the state demands tribute. And whereas I think in the Austrian school, they talk about how money developed out of the free market, and through years of barter and exchange, gold was the most marketable commodity, and therefore it became the best form of money, and therefore that is the best form of money today. And there's some truth to that. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but that doesn't tell the whole story, because, typically throughout history, again, whoever was in power demanded tribute of some kind, payment, taxes, however you want to, define that. And basically whatever they said they wanted as tribute, to a certain extent became money, because then everybody else knew that they had to pay that tribute. So if they could trade amongst themselves to get that form of money to pay that tribute, that kind of became money, right?
Right.
Now, I think sometimes along the way, that tribute was gold, right?
Yeah.
So there was, and sometimes along the way it was paper. Sometimes along the way it was seashells. Sometimes along the way it was, iron or copper or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think throughout history, sometimes there was better forms of money than others. And I think despite what the state said was money, gold also operated as money, in the black market or in the private market, or however you want to. So maybe there was dual forms of money along the way. But the point is if you got to that end of the year, the end of that season, and you had to pay your tribute and you didn't have it, violence was going to come upon you.
Right. Yeah.
Same ways, if you don't pay your taxes year after year, eventually you're going to get that knock on the door. Right. And then you have the choice of paying or not. And if you don't, then there will be consequences.
Absolutely.
That's just the way it is. You don't have to like it, but it's the way it is.
I think it's a great point that we have to expound the definition of violence, that it's not direct, overt violence. You go outside your door and the state's whacking you with a stick. I mean, it's your behavior occurs in the shadow of violence, right? Like if you go and steal from someone or assault someone or don't pay your taxes, the power of the state will be brought against you, which to your point may come as initially as a document in the mail, and then it may come as a knock on the door, and then it may be a whack on the head, The other definition,
it's different in different societies and different countries, right? There are some countries when you walk outside, they're hitting you with a stick, making you go to work to.
Yes. We spent a few months in Bali at one point, and they have a different kind of government system. They have like a local regional government, and then they have the larger central state government. And the local regional government still goes door to door. They go door to door. A couple of guys roll up on their little bikes, smoking cigarettes, looking standoffish, and they want you to hand them some money. So it's a lot. It's alive and well in the world. And so the other definition the Austrians give of the state is that it is the apparatus of coercion and compulsion, basically. So to have, and this is where it gets murky for me, because to your point, the pure free market has never existed because property has always been vulnerable to aggression. I guess you could always go and physically take someone's property or just wield violence to demand payment of property. But that emerged, that local, the threat of violence basically incites the existence of government, because what you want then is someone to hold that power that prevents anyone else from using the power of violence or coercion or compulsion or fraud over you, such that you can have peaceful and productive trade to create wealth. So I think my current view of how this happened is that history sort of forms these little economic enclaves, which may be originally in just a small geographic territory, right? Where one guy is the most violent guy in the room. He's the biggest conqueror. He's got a few square miles of territory. Everyone go on and mind your business, conduct your business freely, but make sure you always pay this guy. But then as soon as this guy's territory comes into contact with another similar guy's territory, they kind of fight it out. And then whoever wins conquers the whole territory, and then it just rolls forth. So government, in my current view, is kind of this centralizing monopoly on violence. But that's where it's like, I can't get my head around how you could have free market pricing in the market for violence, because it's a natural monopoly. The guy's always a monopolist, so he's always going to be prone to charge monopoly prices in the form of taxation, currency monopolization, and inflation, even, where there's always this temptation, I guess, to siphon wealth off the productive economy that's inherent to all governments throughout all history. And so I think the point in Graeber's book is that, gold did emerge in the free market as money, but the state also influences what the shape of money's evolution because of what it demands in tax. That creates a demand for money that might not be gold, right? It's been barley, it's been fish, it's been all these other things. Sure. Some governments wised up and actually started to hoard the gold, and then they would make people denominate their transactions in silver or something, even softer currency, for instance, just so they could, kind of control the wealth. So maybe we could jump into one of these examples. I'm looking at just some of the stuff from the book here, and he talks about, I guess one thing we could blow out of the water initially is just that people think typically it's barter. Then people figure out, hey, barter is a real pain in the ass. Why don't we use something as money? And then you get money. But that's not what Graeber's, the anthropological record says, frankly. It says we instead use debt as the medium of exchange, in a way, IOUs, before we get into barter. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that.
Well, and I think, and I have to give credit to a friend of mine, Travis, who pointed this book out to me. It was about a year ago. And the funny thing is Travis, I don't think he'll care that I say this, but he's actually a client of mine, but he's also a friend of mine. And we got into this long debate on Twitter in front of everybody, and not many people argue with their clients in a public forum, right? But like we were really going back and forth on this. And he was arguing kind of the Keynesian statist viewpoint, and I was arguing the Austrian viewpoint. And he basically said, I get what you're saying, and theoretically that could happen, but it never did. Something to that effect, right? And I said, well, that's your theory. Maybe that didn't, but maybe it happened the way I'm saying it too. And he said, but there's no evidence that what you're saying ever actually took place. And he said, read this book. So it was about a year ago. So I went and got the book, and I was kind of looking to read it and kind of denounce it a little bit. But it was very good. And the problem, it turns out to be knowledge is always good, even if it's painful to receive.
Yep.
It was really well researched, right? And he just goes, if you get the book and you look into the notes section, the amount of research he did and the historical record that he cites is extremely hard to disagree with. Now, if somebody out there has an equally well-cited resource or a book or something that they can send me that says the opposite, I would love to read that as well, right? But this isn't something the guy just made up. Like, he's got the historical record to kind of back him up, and he kind of went through and said, basically, debt and money created at the same time because at the beginning of the local power would say, you owe me this at this time period, right? And maybe the local king would say, maybe he'd give you a piece of land, or he would give you some money or give you something to get started, but then you had to pay tribute back to him, 3 months or 6 months or a year or whatever it was. So the money that you got, of the currency, there was always an IOU, or there was always kind of there was either labor attached to it or money that had to be paid back at the end of it. And so, that is how money developed, because the state power would say, you need to pay us tribute for this. But then the other way of explaining it is that's the way the state got things done. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say the king, the king of the realm or the power of the realm wants to develop, first of all, the first thing he wants to do is remain in power, right? So he has to get an army. Well, how does he get an army? Well, he says, you're now in the army. And if you're not in the army, then you get put to death, right? Yeah. And so now you're in the army. Okay, so now your job in the army is now you're going to go build roads. Okay, so what do you get in exchange for building roads? Well, you get food and you get shelter and you don't get shot in the back, right? Yeah. So so that's how he got the roads built, right? But then he also needed to eat. The king needed to eat, and he wasn't a farmer himself, so he needed somebody to go plant the fields. And so he would give the farmers or the peasants or whoever they were, the capital, either the tools or the money to go do that. But then at the end of the year, they had to sell that grain and pay that tribute or that money back to him. So in other words, the money the state had to issue the money before the state could ask for the money, right? Unless that state, which didn't happen very often, but unless that state used free market money and just accepted payment in free market money, well, then the state had to issue the money in the first place.
Right.
If seashells were or whatever the denomination of the money was, if it didn't just spring up out of the ground, then they had to make it, whether it was the paper or whether it was copper rivets or whatever it was, it came from the state. And that's the way the state got things done. It's the way the state got provisions. It's the way the state developed the territory, for lack of a better word. And if and then because everybody knew that at the end of the year, at the end of the month, whatever, they had to pay this back to the tax authority, to the king, then that kind of became money amongst themselves as well. So as an example, if I'm a farmer and I go out and I plant the ground and I harvest it and then I sell the wheat and I get a certain amount of money, but let's say the king says I owe him, I don't know, 50 pieces of silver at the end of the month, and I've only got 40 for selling. Well, I've got to go get 10 somewhere else. So then maybe I go borrow those from Joe next door, who makes shoes or who is a log cutter or whatever it is. But because that guy has money or that guy has silver or whatever the currency is, because he's got to pay to the king as well, right? So trade would develop between private individuals of that form of money, because both of those people or all of those people knew that they also had to pay the authority money or tribute or tax or however you want to describe that. And so that Graeber argues that is typically
right, and
actually most often how an economy developed, how debt was typically part of it, and how money developed into the system as opposed to just a system of barter. He goes through a pretty exhaustive research of saying, the theory that the Austrian school talks about, and I'm not saying this never happened. It probably did happen at some point on some level. It just wasn't a global phenomenon that happened everywhere where, if you had, I use the example, if you had a shoemaker who wanted a steak, he had to go around and find somebody who was growing cows that wanted a pair of shoes. Right.
Right.
And everybody knows that that's just extremely inefficient and just doesn't really. And when you think about it, when you stop and think about it, there's no way a whole economy runs on that method, right? It would be extremely slow and cumbersome.
There'd be no trade, essentially.
There would be basically, there'd be essentially no trade.
Yeah.
And so and furthermore, there's just almost zero anthropological evidence that ever happened on any large scale. So. But this is where I guess the real world comes into conflict with the Austrian school theory a little bit. Like I'm very sympathetic to the Austrian school idea. If there was no local power and there was no government and there was no state that was saying this is what you are demanded to pay tribute in, then in a free market, I think it would develop exactly the way the Austrian school holds.
Agreed.
Right. And so I think the Austrian school is a very hopeful and a very beautiful way of thinking about things, right? That's a voluntary system is perhaps the most moral, perhaps the most likable, enjoyable. Nobody wants to be forced to do anything, right?
The most wealth generating too.
The most wealth generating, right? And I think when you look around the world, when you look at the societies that are the most free. Now, again, there's nowhere is absolutely free.
Yeah.
Governments are inherently intrusive, right? But some governments are more intrusive than others. And I think when you look around the world and we would look throughout history, the governments that are least intrusive have the most growth and have the most, not just growth, but most wealth and the most happiness and the most, whatever word I'm looking for, right?
Standard of living,
because I think individuals are more creative when they figure it out. I think the free market is more creative than any government decree.
Yeah.
So, I think there's room for both schools of thought, but I think to get married to either one of them, you're looking for trouble.
Right. You know what? This calls to mind that even today, government is the biggest buyer in the market, effectively.
Sure.
And I think throughout most of history, it stands to reason that the government would typically, not always, to your point, there's been freer societies, right? When America was initially founded, government was not the biggest buyer in the marketplace. We had a lot of free trade. We generated a lot of wealth. Early Hong Kong, I think, was similar, had very low levels of taxation, government intervention, created a lot of wealth. But over time, the state becomes more and more entrenched and more of an influence in the marketplace, we could say. So I think that maybe would be somewhat of Graeber's argument, is that government typically, was and is typically one of the biggest buyers in the market, and government is inherently non-free market because they are a monopolist, as we've said. And so I agree that the Austrians, they do a great job of laying the principles, foundational principles of economic understanding. I would argue they even describe really well the consequences of state intervention. But I don't know that they've ever, and I don't know that there is a solution, frankly, to not having this natural monopoly on violence emerge in the marketplace. Like, so long as we conduct ourselves in physical reality and we have to have physical transfer of goods and services, we need physical security. So it's always going to kind of centralize to one guy. And so the way I see this is that road to the monopoly on violence, where the two, competing regions intersect and then one guy conquers the other, that's kind of like premised on looting initially. Like the guy that's the specialist in violence is just looting people directly. But as these economic enclaves are established and expand, I think Graeber's argument is they move away from IOU, debt-based monies to something like coinage. So I guess the state would accept any form, right? If they're going to loot you for gold, you can pay taxes in gold. Whatever the market has said is money, they'll accept as payment. But over time, they start to monopolize, the money itself and issue coinage. So coinage, in his view, ends up being something to systemize the payment and collection of taxes. Whereas this is one divergence that I'm not sure about. I think the Austrian view is that coinage emerges as a private free market certification function. So that instead of needing to weigh and assay the gold in each transaction, you could just trust the issuer. But the state over time monopolizes the issuer. So
then not only do they monopolize it, but then they take advantage of it, right? And they start flipping the coins and diluting the money, and it eventually ends in tears, right?
Yes.
And that's why I think comparing and contrasting the two systems. This is why I think it's important to understand both systems. I think the Austrian school does a great job of laying out the hopeful way things could be. And they do a great job of laying out where we're going to end up as a result of not doing it that way. But they don't necessarily do a good job of explaining the interim.
Yes.
And I think the Keynesians, for lack of a better word, or the MMTers, or however you want to label them, they don't necessarily do a good job of the fundamentals, and they don't necessarily do a good job of explaining where we're going to end up, but they do a very good job of explaining what's actually happening right now.
Yeah.
And so I think it's, at least for me, it's important to kind of have one foot in each camp and not be strictly. I mean, I know which one I like better. I like the Austrian school better.
Right.
But the Austrian school, to me, the Austrian school is paradise, right? And paradise just isn't realistic. Like, the world is often it's a beautiful place and it's a cool place, and but it's a danger. It could be a dangerous place. And what's that saying? The power of war is a vacuum. Like
nature abhors a vacuum.
Nature,
Right.
and like, the idea that we're all going to just be in this voluntary society. I love the idea. And I personally am kind of a anarchist, right? Like I don't want any. I would like there not to be a government. I'd like there to be free exchange, and we all just figure it out, and wild west kind of thing. But the wild west, a lot of people died, right? And a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't want the wild west, and they like the stability that goes along with a centralized power.
Yeah.
And the certainty that goes along with the centralized power. And I think, again, one of the things that I think that the Austrian school does a good job of, or maybe it's not just the Austrian school, maybe call them the libertarian community or however you want to define that, is that I think they've done a good job of explaining that even if the guy next door is not coming in and looting your house, and even though you feel safer, there is actually a big bad thief out there, and he happens to sit in the White House, right? Or he happens to sit in the government building. So you're never really safe from these aggressors or the thieves. Yeah. It's just a matter of, sometimes they dress a little better and they speak nicer, and they come across with an air of honorability, but the actions are actually not that much different. Right.
It's a little less obvious, perhaps, for those that don't understand. But that the decrease in obviousness allows it to be perpetrated at a much larger scale, right? Because people just don't know. I agree.
Do you know who Rick Rule is?
I do, yeah.
So I love Rick. I've known Rick for a long time, and he's just a great guy, and he's a great thinker. And he's very much in the natural resource and the gold space, and so he's invested in countries all over the world, and has been in the halls of Congress and the deepest, darkest jungles of Africa, right? For business. And he loves telling the story about, how he's been in countries with, warlords that are running things. And he's been in the state of California, and he's never been robbed as bad as he was in the state of California from the state of California, right? He said they did immensely more damage to me than any warlord ever did. So anyway, it's just all a matter of perspective.
They monopolize all that beautiful part of the country down there, and they really take advantage of it.
Right.
I would, on the MMT Keynesian piece, I do think they're doing a good job, perhaps, of describing what the state apparatus has grown into. Like it's a mess, frankly. Yeah. But the MMT, when they start to present this solution of just printing, inflation and taxation, some type of two levers you can pull to infinity of moving a market, I totally think that's BS. I mean, I think they're trying to put a Band-Aid on this unhealable wound that the Austrians have identified. It's like, so long as you have state intervention, if we just look at the currency, Mises says that you either have the crack up boom, hyperinflation, or you have a deflationary bust. Once you start manipulating the money, you have one of two outcomes. You can defer it and delay it and keep printing money and do all these things, but it's going to happen at some point. So, I think that like Stephanie Kelton, perhaps, where she actually thinks we can just print money forever and that makes the market healthy. Like I fundamentally reject that thesis. I don't think that makes any sense.
So I do too. And one thing I would say though is I think there's a lot of people out there. And first of all, say I have not read her book, but I've read a bunch of stuff by her and some of the other people that agree with her.
Same.
And so this isn't a criticism of her book, but I would. And this is going to sound a little hypocritical, so I'm going to tell somebody to do it, even though I haven't done it myself. I do think it would be a good exercise to read her book, or to read the stuff that her and her like-minded colleagues say, because, and this is where I think it's important. I think a lot of people equate MMT with the further MMT policies. So what I mean by that is in MMT, in modern monetary mechanics is really just describing what actually happens. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, she is actually 100% right. And
Descriptive,
Warren Mosler, who's kind of the father, I mean, they're basically describing how the system works. And they're right. It is how the system works. So to say that they're wrong or that they're off base, I think that they're off base and that this can just be perpetuated forever without consequences. I think they're 100% off base. But if you want to understand how the system actually works, it's kind of imperative that you do read some of that stuff. But again, it gets to the current, what's happening now versus where we're going to end up.
Yes.
So if you want to understand where we're at now, you kind of need to understand that. I think the people I think there's a lot of people who hear the words MMT or some of this stuff and they automatically just won't read it because they already know the result. Yeah. And I think that there's a danger in doing that. I think there's a danger in saying, I know where we're going to end up, so I don't want to read about it or I don't want to know about it. I don't need to know about it. I actually think that's wrong. I think you actually do need to know about it. Yeah. Because that destination that we're going to get to, it might be 3 months, but it might be 30 years from now. Yep. Right. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but no. That's important.
Great point. And I agree with you that it's accurately describing the mechanics of the system as it is. So it's descriptive, but in my mind, it's based on faulty premise of money. I guess what takes this Graeber view as an absolute almost, that the state owns the money, the end. There's no free market force. There's no counter to that at all. So it kind of misidentifies the fundamentals. And I also think it mischaracterizes something like inflation. It's like, it takes this view that inflation is necessary for a healthy economy, the typical Keynesian view, instead of, it's clearly theft. No one voluntarily holds an inflationary currency. No one. You'll never find a willing counterparty to that trade. Everyone wants a money that doesn't inflate or reliably, if it does have to inflate like gold, like it has low and predictable inflation. So it's more resistance to supply manipulation is lower counterparty risk in money. Yeah, effectively. I don't think we identify that.
So here's where I think it gets really interesting, because on the one hand, I completely agree with you. But then on the other hand, I think you're wrong. And I think I'm wrong. And again, I think Graeber's book, I think this is why everybody should read Graeber's book, because I think it does a good job of kind of pointing this out, is because it gets back to what's the definition of money, right? Who defines what money is? Now there's what you and I think if we were left to our own devices, we could probably agree that we should just let the market figure out what money is, right? And I think you and I would probably agree that we could probably narrow it down to 2 or 3 things that would become money that we would agree on, right? But then the other side of the argument, and this is Graeber's argument, is what you and I think is a fantasy, because it's never actually been that way. Right. And that what's always actually been money is whatever the state said it was, right? Yeah. And if the state says it's dollars, then it's dollars. And if they say it's copper, then it's copper. And if they say it's tulips, then it's tulips. And you can have these fancy theories and funny stories that you tell yourself, but money is whatever the state says it is. And so from that perspective, I think she's saying, listen, we can issue whatever money we want. And we can use all our power to enforce its use, including violence. I think it's a very statist view, right? It's the whole, MMT is the description of the statist view of money. Yes. And I guess you just have to decide for yourself which one you, then this is a, which one you personally like versus which one actually exists, right? Yeah. So, and I think that's kind of one of the things where I kind of get off base with a lot of either people who don't agree with my point of view of fiat currency and gold and Bitcoin and some of these other things, because whereas I'm a fan, quote unquote fan of individually chosen forms of money, whether it's gold or Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever it is. I try not to be a fan of any investments, because if you're a fan of something, your judgment is eternally clouded. Like, I was talking to somebody the other day, And I grew up in Nebraska. And in Nebraska, football's a religion. Like everybody just loves the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And when I was growing up, for the first 30 years of my life, they were one of the greatest football teams of the country. They were perennially in the top 10, won a number of national championships. And for the last 20 years, they've just been awful. Yeah. But every year I'm like, they are going to win. And it's because I'm biased, right? I'm a fan. Yes. But if you look at it objectively, then for the last 10 or 20 years, we've been awful. And you would never bet on them, and you certainly wouldn't go all in on them, right? And I think sometimes, not that we're talking about investing, but when it comes to investing, I think sometimes people confuse a good investment with what they're a fan of, just because they like it conceptually. Yes. And anyway, another tangent by me.
Excellent point, though, because I will admit this in myself, even that my journey into understanding Bitcoin is, clearly the show. What is money? You ask these fundamental questions that take you deep down the rabbit hole. And
sorry, somebody was calling me.
Yeah, sure, no sweat. You can't help but, if you understand the promise that Bitcoin holds, right? Even if we're just talking about the promise, not the practicality, although there is a lot of practicality there, you can't help but be a fan of it. You're like, okay, this is the thing that could separate money and state and, create all this additional wealth and freedom that we've talked about. Then you have to evaluate it pragmatically. But by virtue of you even being a fan of it, as you said, you have to you have to check yourself. You have to take yourself into account. Like, how much am I looking at this thing through rose-colored glasses versus, being purely pragmatic? So I agree with you on that. Here's where all right. So give me a second to unravel this, because this is where I think things get really interesting. Agreed. There's never been a free market or a government separate from money, essentially. We could say it has sort of happened, but it hasn't persisted over time historically.
Yep.
The book that I mentioned a lot, that I don't know if you've read or not, it's called The Sovereign Individual. Mm-hmm. So what we end up talking about then is the state has always monopolized money because it could, effectively, right? Money is the most important tool for humans. If you can control that tool, you can control people. And that's essentially what government's trying to do.
Totally agree.
So to argue, I think my counter argument to like a Graeber or an MMT perspective that we're the state, we can do whatever we want. My counter argument would be that we've never had money independent of state because the tech has never existed. And this gets into the actual calculus of violence, the logic of violence, which is something the Sovereign Individual explores in depth. And so an allegory here may have been like in the year 1500, or we'll say late 1400s, you probably wouldn't have bet against the church. The church had been running the show for a long time. They had a stranglehold on knowledge, information, printing of books, wealth. They were running the show. And so to be part of that bureaucracy was the way to have power in the world effectively. But then, as we know, something seemingly harmless emerges, like a printing press, just a little piece of tech. Next thing you know, we've increased the rate of book production by thousands of percentage points, many orders of magnitude. Church loses its monopoly on knowledge and therefore starts its descent as the dominant institution in the world. And the book goes in depth how many technologies like gunpowder has changed the logic of violence. The stirrup on a horse, little things that you wouldn't even think about. They actually change the way we can project power across space and time. So it changes the way we organize our institutions. And so Bitcoin, the theory there at least, is that Bitcoin is so much more expensive to confiscate, so much more difficult to confiscate versus, gold or someone just taxing your bank account, which is very low cost to confiscate, that it's essentially changing this calculus of violence, pushing us away from a statist society towards I guess you could call it an anarcho-capitalist society where the vast, maybe not all exchanges would be purely voluntary. You'd still have violence and whatnot, but the cost benefit on violence collapses. So all of a sudden violence is a much less profitable enterprise. And we get into a world characterized by much more voluntary exchange. So yeah, kind of a long-winded counter argument there, but I just wanted to lay out the Bitcoiner position as I see it.
Well, so I think there's a couple of things I would say there. And again, I think this is probably where I've been greatly misunderstood along the way is typically when I do these podcasts or these shows, I do them as Brent Johnson of Santiago Capital, which is a wealth management firm in which makes investments on behalf of clients, right? And my job in that role is not to be a moralist. My job is not to be, a social justice warrior. My job is to make money, right? They don't hire me for my politics. God knows they don't hire me for my politics. They don't hire me for my social media. They don't hire me for my, personal beliefs. They hire me because they want me to figure out some way to get through the financial chaos or uncertainty that's to come. They have other sources to get their, religion or morals or social beliefs, right?
Right.
They haven't sought me out for that. So there's a difference between what I would personally like to see and what I would personally do versus what I would do on behalf of clients. And I agree that the technology that has been developed with regard to Bitcoin, I don't know if it's revolutionary, but it has certainly, I guess that's probably the best way to say it. I actually don't think the technology is that advanced. It's a ledger. It's a digital ledger. And to me, that is the simplicity is its beauty, right?
Yes, agreed.
So it's not like it's some super complicated thing that nobody in the world can understand. It's actually fairly simple to understand once you take the time to understand it. Now, maybe the cryptography around it and the ability to send that information quickly and effortlessly around the world immediately, that's kind of maybe that's the technological evolution, but the system itself is miraculously simple, right?
Yes.
And that's its beauty. And so I think that it has great potential and great power. And the fact that Bitcoin went to $60,000 from being a penny, 12 years ago, or a tenth of it? What did it start off as? A tenth of a penny or a hundredth of a penny? I don't remember.
Below a cent. Yeah, I think it was
below a penny, right?
4/10 of a cent, maybe.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that in and of itself shows that the market, not the state, but the real market, and this goes back to the Austrian school, right? The market is demanding an alternative to the state-sponsored form of money. And it's clear that there was great demand for this because it went from a penny to $60,000. Now, you can argue there's different reasons why it went that high, and some people would say it's the pure market at work, and other people will say it's a speculative mania, other people will say it's manipulation, but the fact is that it went there, right? And so from that perspective, I think it shows two things. It shows that the private market can provide a solution. You don't have to have state-sponsored money. It can come from the market. But I think it also showed, I think it is starting to show, is maybe a better way to say it, that states don't like competition, right? And so I have been, I don't know, pilloried, is that the word? Pillar?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it for saying that governments would strike back. Yeah. And
against Bitcoin.
And against Bitcoin or against crypto, however you want to, digital assets, however you want to define that space. It's so funny. Sometimes I'll say crypto, sometimes I'll say Bitcoin. If I say Bitcoin, somebody will come back and they'll say, but that's not crypto. If I say crypto, they'll say, well, that's not Bitcoin. Yeah. I kind of use them interchangeably. Anyway. My point is only that this is my opinion, and I might be wrong in this, but my opinion is that many in the the Bitcoin world, especially the Bitcoin maximalists. I think you've had some experience with the Bitcoin maximalists recently.
Plenty of experience with those guys.
I think that they have vastly overstated the ability to take on the state. And I am not saying that it's impossible for Bitcoin to win this battle. I will never say anything is impossible. But the idea that the governments are powerless and can't do anything about it and are helpless against the rise of Bitcoin, I think is just utter fantasy. Because they are very powerful. There is a lot of things they can do. And I think many people who think that this rise of Bitcoin is inevitable and fiat currencies are going to fall and they're all going to be at the mercy of Bitcoin, I don't think they've studied history. This is just typically not how it goes. And I don't think that they have an appreciation to the lengths of which governments will go to remain in power. Right. I mean, wars are fought over these kinds of things. Really, really, really bad things happen when governments try to stay in power. Yeah. I mean, we don't have time to go through all of them, and we could spend the next 20 hours talking about these things. Yeah. And it's absolutely horrible things that have happened as a result. And so the idea that, in my opinion, the governments are just going to sit by and let this happen without fighting back and without extracting some extreme amount of pain along the way, I think is just silly, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think countermeasures, agreed completely. I think that's happening right now. Like there would be no talk of CBDCs if there wasn't Bitcoin. Clearly,
totally agree. Totally agree.
And they're mobilizing.
This is just one of the ways they're fighting back.
Yeah, and depending on how much of your, or I guess what size tinfoil hat you want to put on, you could argue that there's a lot of other things going on that are in a direct response to the threat of Bitcoin. And so I guess I see that happening. I agree that's going to happen. I've long thought that is going to be probably the most dystopian thing we see, is whatever the real state countermeasure to Bitcoin is.
Yeah, I agree.
Could be something like an IMF coin or whatever, one world currency type thing, which is, of biblical proportions bad. But I guess the bet for me on Bitcoin is that, or again, back to simplicity, it's just Gresham's law playing out at a geopolitical level. It's like they have to end up holding some of this thing. The longer it succeeds in the market, you're then playing this geopolitical game where you need to save some of the harder money and spend softer monies. So borrow and spend currencies. And over time, that dynamic just spirals out of control, where you see countries end up fighting over, hash rate and Bitcoin position and whatnot. But in the process of that, what's happening is the currency monopolies are basically being devitalized, so that, the more inflation you've created more demand for inflation resistant money. So individuals are adopting it, corporations are adopting it, ultimately states are adopting it. Well, then they're losing their power to confiscate wealth via inflation. And for the US, that was half the US revenue, at least in 2020. We had 4 trillion direct tax revenues. We printed 4 trillion. Yep. So that's a big blow to state power and state revenue. Let me ask you this. So it's kind of a two-pronged question, and we sort of talked about this in Miami. One is the state operating in a free market? So like if you look at things at a geopolitical level, would you define that as a free market? Because it's just might makes right, effectively, the geopolitical level.
That's a very good point.
And then the second part of the question, which I asked you in Miami, but I'd love for you to reiterate a bit, is if the free market was left to its own devices, what money does it choose?
Yeah. So it's both I love both questions. And I do think that on the geopolitical level, the global level, the country level, it is a free market, because the reality is that those levels, there are no rules. And the rules that do exist can be rewritten pretty quickly. You know, I love and hate this quote at the same time. It was Kissinger said, the illegal we do right away, the unconstitutional, that takes a little bit longer. Right?
That guy.
Right. I mean, he's considered one of the greatest geopolitical and political thinkers in history. Right. But so that just tells you what these people are like. Right. The people that play at this level, that gives you a sense of their mindset. Yeah. And I don't think he was joking. I think he said it kind of on an off the cuff jest, kind of to be funny. Right. But I have no doubt that he meant it. Right.
Well, it's happening everywhere right now. You know?
Yeah. No. And so from that perspective, I do think that is about as close to a free market as you get. I'm sorry, I just forgot the second part of the question.
Yeah, the second one is just if a free market was prevailing in the world, and I guess you could answer this at either level. And this sort of gets into the future of money question. What money is selected on the free market?
Well, so it's my belief that if we had a free market, so it's kind of two questions. If on the global level, if we had a free market, not just at the government level, but at an individual level on a global basis, my guess is that there would be multiple currencies. I think that gold I personally think gold would be the highest form of money in that situation, but I think that there would be multiple forms of money. And I think maybe gold would be like go into hiding because it was Gresham's law, right? Maybe it wouldn't be used as money for that reason. Maybe Bitcoin or something like Bitcoin, some kind of a digital coin, would be up there. What I think for the future of money, what I think will happen, I don't think we're going to go back to a gold standard. My guess is that when the monetary system is either crashed and rebuilt or reset willingly or reset unwilling, whatever, my guess is that the next iteration will be a state-sponsored digital currency. And it's possible it's some kind of a multi-country coordinated, agreed to type of a thing. Maybe it's a basket of digital currencies, and maybe there's partially backed by oil and gold and some other commodities in order to, but I don't think, number one, I don't think it's going to be a gold standard. And number two, I don't think it's going to be a free market money. I think it will still be a state-sponsored money. Well, I'd say that in the next iteration. Now, maybe in 2 or 3 iterations down the road, maybe we do get to some kind of a individually chosen market-based solution that due to the new technology that's available. Right.
Yeah, the fulcrum in my mind, it really comes down to this. It really comes down to tech and the logic of violence. Like we're all, I don't want to say we're all, what is it? The economists call us, rational economic actors, homo economicus kind of thing. But over longer time horizons, societies do sort of shift towards the most economically efficient way of being. And so who knows what else the digital age is going to throw off here, but like 3D printing guns, I think is a big game, like levels the game, or the playing field, you might say. These various abilities that digital tech gives us to be anonymous or separate ourselves from our identity or move money without, asking anyone's permission. Like all of these things are counterbalancing to the enforcement of state power over individuals. So I guess for me, the big question is how far does that go?
Well, I think maybe you just touched on something that's kind of important to think about is, to a certain extent, I think the rise of technology is making the use of black market money easier. Yeah. If that's the right way to say it. Yeah. And so perhaps, well, this gets very philosophical and it gets a little bit dark.
Perfect.
And I always tell people that I swear to God, I'm not like this dark, unhappy person, right? I think it's a beautiful world, and I love to travel and meet, but I just think that we have some tough times ahead of us. History tells me that we do, and as I mentioned in Miami, like I really do think that we're in this fourth turning, and unfortunately, and I don't think we're through it yet. I think fourth turnings are, times of great pain, not little pain and annoyance and frustration, but just like real pain. Yeah. And I think we've had some frustration and angst and annoyance, but I don't think we've had real pain yet. Yeah. Some people have, but just on the complete country or even global level, I don't think we've had it yet. And I think what often happens before the spring, this re-emergence and everything's great, is unfortunately the state typically gets stronger. Right before it breaks, it gets stronger and it gets darker and it gets meaner. Right. And so I actually think, and there was another book, I referenced this on my presentation in Miami, and a friend of mine pointed it out to me, and I read it, and I just think it's great. It's called The Storm Before the Storm, and it's about what was going on in Rome from in the years 100 BC to 60 BC. So it was like over a 40 to 60 year period. And it talked about all these problems that they had. And, a lot of the problems that they were going through at that time are the same issues that we're going through now. Right. Inequality, the rise of inequality, government corruption, endless wars, on other parts of the empire. And a lot of the local political issues that they were dealing with are similar to what we were having. There was these really hard factions that were, one side of the city was voting this faction, the other side of the city was on the other faction, and it led to violence between the two parties. And I mean, the similarities are just uncanny. And the interesting thing about that is that, that was kind of, again, like around the year 100 BC, but the Roman Empire didn't fall, quote unquote, for another 500 years. Right. And so the point is these things just take a really long time to play out. And in that book, they hadn't even got to the time of the Caesars yet. They call it the time of the Caesars. The time of the Caesars is basically the time of the dictators. Like during this period of when I'm talking, it was still a republic. Right. All this bad stuff was happening, but they still could vote. They still had choice. But then kind of towards the end of this book is when they were now getting into the time of like Julius Caesar and some of the other Nero and some of these other great Pompey, some of these other great dictators, Roman dictators, for lack of a better word. That came after the storm of and so I kind of feel like we haven't even reached that stage yet. I feel like before we get through to the spring, and again, this is not what I want to happen, but I can see this happening is, governments just don't typically just back down and give away power. And what I really fear is that, with this proliferation of the digital technology and the crypto and the Bitcoin, it has shown, in many ways, I think the government's going to co-opt it and use it to their advantage, unfortunately. Not to our advantage, but to their advantage in order to try. And I ultimately think it will fail, but not initially, right? Yeah. When I say fail, it might be 20 or 30 years from now before it fails. Yeah. But I think that intervening time period could be really tough. And I think, for many places around the world, and I would say this probably started happening, I'd say after the World War II, we probably had 20 to 30 years where we were seen as the good guy in the world, wearing the white hat, the force for good, altruistic, And I'd probably say around Vietnam and then even into the 80s is when that kind of started the shine of that kind of started to wear off. And then I'd say over the last 20 years, I'd say not most, but a lot of the world would say that the U.S. isn't the savior; they're the troublemaker, right? They're the bully on the playground. If it wasn't for them going around causing all these problems, there'd be a lot less problems. Right. And again, I'm very sympathetic to that view. My fear and what I think could really happen is that while I think that view from outside the U.S. is becoming more prevalent, I think internally to the U.S. and I think that we still try to put ourselves forth as the altruistic force for good, the light in the world. And I think when we when we go into Afghanistan and when we go into Syria and we go into Libya and when we take on China or whatever it is, we try to say this is for the greater good. We still try to wear the white hat, right? Yeah. And my fear is that before this is all said and done, is we take off the white hat and we just put on the black hat and we say, screw you guys. You don't like us, tough shit. We're the biggest, baddest dude on the block. And if you want to come at us, give it your best shot. Yeah. And I think that is more likely. And again, I don't want that to happen. Yeah. But I think that is more likely than us rolling over and surrendering our hegemony to another power.
If history is any indicator, the black hat always gets put on towards the end. I think your timeline there is interesting, going through the decline of Rome, because I think it was Nero. They were committed to a hard money standard for many centuries, and then Nero started debasing the coin again. And that's what really accelerated the collapse of the Roman Empire. And then to your point, in the US, we had this 20, 30-year period where we had, the shining light of the world. But 1971, we started aggressively debasing the currency again. And here we are. So these two things are intimately intertwined.
Well, then to further complicate it and why and we don't need to kind of get into my views on the market, but to further complicate this is I feel like in many ways the whole world is going through a fourth turning, right? And so it's not just the U.S. that's in this situation. Like Europe's in the same situation. Japan's in the same situation. Much of Africa is still in the same situation. And the few parts of the world that aren't in the same negative fiscal situation that we are, they just don't have, their markets aren't big enough necessarily to challenge us from an economic perspective or a military perspective, right? And so, because everybody's in this situation, it's really hard for somebody else to come along and knock us off, right? Yeah. If someone else, if they had been managing their own affairs much better than we had been, I think this would be much more likely that the black hat gets put on and then gets knocked off very quickly. Right. Yeah. But yeah. I feel like I don't know who's going to knock it off. I just really don't. If I'm not necessarily, if I'm looking at it as a dispassionate just analyst, I don't see who does it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to think about. Jumping back into this, we've talked a lot about the relationship between money and violence, the state, and how it's evolved over time. You're very well known for your market commentary and your macro perspectives. So maybe we could just jump into where you see things today. Like, what have you been thinking a lot about? How do you see the macro landscape here in mid 2021?
Yeah. So, I think that's, to me, it's funny because on the one hand, I'll tell you a quick story. So in college, growing up in high school and like early parts of college, I grew up, I had a very all-American, apple pie, baseball existence. I grew up in a little town in Nebraska, and, we had the 4th of July parade and everybody hung, flags out and, all that kind of stuff. And so, I grew up with a very positive view of government, and I was going to be a senator someday. I was going to be the great senator from Nebraska, so to speak. And, so when I was in college, I did an internship in Washington D.C., and I could not have been more excited. I was with a senator. I could not have been more excited to get there. I was just, this was my way. This was going to jumpstart my career in politics. And I got there, and after about 2 weeks after being there, I just hated it. I was like, this is just, I don't like the people. They're full of, they're hypocrites. And it was such I'm so glad I did that internship. Otherwise, I probably would have moved there after college and, been stuck or something. Anyway. that's a long way of saying that, like, I've always kind of been fascinated with politics, and I'm interested in politics, but I hate politicians. And I just, on the one hand, they drive me crazy. But it's endlessly interesting, and it has great effect on my work that I do. Like, you can't ignore politics. If you're going to be unless you're a really long-term investor, like really long-term, and you don't care about any market fluctuations at all, you have to pay attention to what's going on in politics, because again, we don't live in a free market, and the politics has a direct influence on what the markets are going to do. Yeah. And so I think it's been pretty interesting to see some of the things that have happened since Biden got elected. Now, I'll tell you that in 2016, I thought Trump was going to win. I told people ahead of time that he was going to win, and he won. I didn't vote for him, and I would never vote for the guy, but I thought I thought he was going to win it again in 2020. Yeah. To be honest, I was surprised he didn't win. And so it's on the one hand, it's interesting what's happened since then, because I think whatever you think of Trump, I think the one thing that I think most people will agree on is that he did a good job of pointing out that perhaps all of our trade deals and our relationship with China over the previous 8 to 10 or 20 years, however you want to measure that, was perhaps not in our best interest, or was perhaps not done in a way that was the best thing for the United States. And he did it, and I think he did it in a brilliant way. And what I mean by that is he did it in a way that wasn't offensive to China. In other words, ultimately they were offended, but he did a very good job. He would say things like, now, I don't blame Z for this. If I was in Z's shoes, I would have done the exact same thing he did. I blame our previous politicians. I blame our business leaders who agreed to these deals. And he did it in a way that it actually made sense. People were like, yeah, you know what? He's kind of got a point there. Even the people that didn't like Trump were kind of like, he's kind of got a point, And so I thought that even if he didn't win, I thought that he had raised that level of awareness to a point that even if the Democrats wanted to go back to how it was before, they wouldn't be able to. And that's largely what's happened. So Biden won, and he brought in this team, and the team that he brought in is kind of China hawks, for lack of a better word, and they have remained fairly tough on China. And the interesting, and had Trump won, I think Trump would have been tougher on China on a personal level and on a country to country level. But what Trump did not have the ability to do is he did not have any ability to de-escalate a situation. He only knew charge forward, right? Right. And he had no ability to build a consensus. What Biden has been able to do, and with Blinken as Secretary of State, he's been able to build a consensus. And so since, in just, what's he been in office for 6 months, 7 months? There's been several countries that have kind of signed up, not in an official, agreement, but kind of in partnership with the U.S. to kind of start to push back against China. Europe signed up, UK signed up, Australia signed up, Japan signed up. And so, Biden has been able to build a coalition to kind of push back on China. A little like Europe backed out on their China-Europe trade deal. Australia, has had some trouble with China over some trade, and they've kind of sided with the U.S. And so I don't think that would have happened under Trump, right? And so I think it's pretty interesting to kind of see that start to play out. And the reason that's important is because I think for the global, what's the right way to say it? For there to be global calm in the markets, you kind of need there to be global calm between the U.S. and China. Yeah. And the U.S. dollar and the Chinese yuan exchange rate is one of the most important ratios in all of global finance. And, for the most part, the Chinese yuan has been strengthening for the last 6 months. But, the U.S. is kind of, they still rely on dollars a lot for trade and for the growth of their economy. And so, there's kind of this mutual what a symbiotic relationship between the U.S. and China. But I don't think it's going to go as easy for them as maybe they initially thought when Biden got elected. I think they thought maybe it would go back to the way it was under Obama. And so I think that's pretty interesting. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is that, everybody knows I'm pretty outspoken on where I think the dollar is headed. And I think for a number of reasons that in the years ahead, the dollar is going to get much stronger, much to many people's surprise. Now, that hasn't been the case for the last 12 months. And in fact, the dollar's dropped about 9 or 10% from where it was 15 months ago. But what's interesting in addition to that is that it hasn't really dropped over the last 6 months or the 7 months. It's kind of at the same level it was back in November, December. And that's despite, Biden getting in, which I think rightly or wrongly is viewed as a Democrat isn't as fiscally conservative. Now, I personally think doesn't make any difference, but kind of the common perception is that the Democrats would spend more. And then they got
Sorry, could you perhaps summarize your dollar view? I know you're
sure.
famous for it, but just the 2-minute summary for the audience, please.
Sure. So my view is that the common wisdom that the money printer go burr and that the U.S. is going to print a lot of money and as a result the dollar is going to lose its value. My opinion is that is wrong. And the reason that I think that is wrong is that fiat currencies trade relative to each other, and the rest of the world is in the same situation that we are. And I believe they are going to have to print their currency as well. They're going to have to do a number of these MMT style policies in order to, kind of try to get their economies out of the depths. And so I think on a relative basis, for a number of reasons, I think the U.S. on a relative basis is better off than many other places around the world.
So the dollar's the best of the worst.
The dollar's the best of the worst. And not only that is the world is on a US dollar standard. We used to be on a gold standard and it is now on a US dollar standard. Again, whether you like it or not, it's kind of irrelevant. Again, this is about what is, not about what we would like to have. And the reality is to operate on the global stage, dollars are needed. And the rest of the world has borrowed. There's as much global debt denominated in dollars outside the United States as there is inside the United States.
Right.
And so, the rest of the world needs dollars just to service their debt. And then at the end of the day, without, going into too much detail, but we've talked about the monopoly of violence. I mean, the U.S. military enforces the use of the dollar as the world reserve currency. So for a number of reasons, I don't think the dollar's going to zero. I think it's going to go much higher before it goes lower. Now, that's very much out of favor right now, and I've been wrong on that for the last year. But what I find interesting is that all the arguments that are given against the dollar, they actually exist for the other countries as well. And if you look at the last 6 or 7 months, Democrat got into the White House, and then we got an all-Democrat Congress. We had another massive stimulus plan. We've been told there's going to be an infrastructure plan. There'll probably be another stimulus plan. So the point is that despite all of this negative news for the dollar, it hasn't gone down. It's it's basically in the same band that it's been in for 5 years. And so I find that that's pretty interesting. And so I think the fact that it hasn't continued to go down despite all of these very negative, quote unquote, headline things for the dollar. And now we're getting into this stage, coming back to the politics, where I think, we're getting into this, hopefully not too confrontational, but potentially confrontational thing with China. I think that there's going to be more uncertainty and more chaos. I don't know if chaos is the right. It certainly has the potential to be chaos, but certainly I think we'll have higher volatility over the next 18 months than we've had for the last 18 months or the last 15 months, perhaps is the right way to say it. And so I think the politics that are playing out right now is really interesting. Not just in the U.S., because, it's not going to be that long when we're going to have midterm elections. Was that another year, 15, 18 months away?
Yeah.
So that's going to start heating up. But then it's not just in the U.S. either. It's like, Germany has big elections that are coming up. A lot of Europe has elections that are coming up. And, things aren't rosy in Europe at all. People talk about how the Fed is buying so many bonds and essentially monetizing the debt. I think the numbers that you quoted earlier, I think, are correct. But what a lot of people forget is, so if you look at all the treasuries that the Fed has bought, I think the Fed owns 26% of all treasuries that have been issued, which is a huge number. Except when you look at Europe, they've done 45%.
Right.
So last year alone, Europe, the European Central Bank monetized 85% of all EU sovereign issuance, and this year they're on pace to do over 100%.
Wow.
So things aren't great in Europe either.
Japan is 75 or 80%.
Well, I think they're in the 40s, but I think they're doing like 75% of current issuance or something like that. So I got to look that up. But the point is the numbers are high.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Everybody's monetizing the debt. It's just a matter of how many steps. Is it direct? It's not necessarily direct. There's one or two steps they go through, but essentially, all major countries are having to do that in one form or another. And because it's a relative game, I think what happened. So again, my thesis on the dollar is what I explained earlier, but in conjunction with all of this debt that's been issued, I think debt is going to have consequences. Now, it hasn't for 30 years, 40 years. We've just borrowed and borrowed and borrowed, and we've had the economies that continued to grow and grow. Then the crash for a year, and then they grow again because more is borrowed. I think that this eventually is going to have severe consequences. And when that debt crisis starts, I think it will become a sovereign debt crisis and a currency crisis. And I think that is what will lead to the dollar getting stronger.
Right.
And so what I think happened with COVID, I think because COVID was not a regional thing. And not even, it wasn't country specific and it wasn't even regional specific, but it was global. It was such a global thing that it forced, for lack of a better word, everybody to kind of work together to kind of get through it. And when I say everybody, I mean all the different countries, kind of coordinated efforts. Whereas I think if it was just a regional thing, I'm not sure if that coordination and that cooperation would have happened. And I think going forward, I'm not sure. I think we've had this 30-year period of globalization where cooperation was the norm, but I think that pendulum has swung, and I think we're now swinging back the other way. This fourth turning where that globalization is breaking, and I think it's swinging back the other way. And so I'm not sure we're going to see that same level of cooperation amongst countries going forward, and I'm not sure that that we will have this peace, love, and harmony amongst all actors that we've had for a long time. Yeah. Again, I hope I'm wrong on all of this stuff. I really do. But I just think that I think these things take a long time to play out. And I think once the battleship is turned, it's really hard to turn. Yeah. And I think the globalization battleship was going that way for a long time, but I think that ship has turned. Yeah. I think it's headed the other way for a while.
Yeah, there's kind of a confluence of forces here where you typically see the middle class getting eroded before there's a major structural change at the society level. But we have a collapsing middle class in the US, but a burgeoning middle class in Asia area. Yep. So it's interesting to see how that'll play out. I had Jeff Booth on once, and one of his I forget who told him this. It was one of his friends, I believe. He said that currency wars lead to trade wars, lead to real wars. Yeah. Clearly, we're heavily engaged in the currency war. The trade wars started to pick up a bit in the Trump presidency. Where do you see threat of real warfare in 2021 or beyond? Is it U.S. China, or where do you see the lines being drawn?
So, God, I hope I'm wrong. I really do.
Yes. Agreed.
My son is just kind of becoming a teenager, and God, the last thing I want is 5 or 6 years from now for there to be a war. I mean, it kills me to even think about it. Yeah. But I think that that's probably likely at some point, and hopefully it will be short and fast and regionally based and not some global calamity. But, the lines have a little bit been drawn. I do tend to agree with that. Economic war, the trade war, the military war. And again, I think that the U.S. as the hegemon will do everything in its power to keep it, and I think China views their quote unquote manifest destiny, for lack of a better word, is to become the next global power and to eventually succeed the United States. Perhaps they won't admit that, and perhaps they don't think that happens for 50 or 60 years. But I think it would be, if I were to speak to a group of Chinese and they were to tell me that that is not their goal, I would find that rather surprising.
Right.
Perhaps in polite company they would say that's not their goal, but behind the scenes, I would be really surprised if that wasn't their goal. And so I think that inherently you're going to have a conflict. Eventually the number two guy wants to be the guy, right? That's just kind of the way things go.
Darwinian reality. Yep.
The Darwinian reality, right? And so I hope there's a way that we can figure out to avoid it, but my guess is that there will be some of that involved. Yeah. I think, and this is kind of why I don't think that there's this big, I don't know, theme is the right way to say it, but I find that there's this big belief that China and Russia are in partnership against the United States. And I actually don't think that that's correct. I don't think it will be correct. I'm not saying that they don't partner on some deals, and I'm not saying that they don't use each other, to help each other from, because again, I think they would each like to get out from underneath the thumb of the dollar, or the U.S. as the global bully. But I don't think that they're going to have this grand partnership from an economic and certainly not from a military perspective. I just don't see that happening. The reality is that Russia has never gone to war with the United States. In every major war, Russia and the United States have been allies. Yeah. And it actually makes more sense for the United States and Russia to be allies than for Russia and China to be allies. I think that Putin and Xi are probably the two biggest strong men of the last 80 years, and maybe two of the top 5 of the last 100 years. I mean, Putin has enormous power, and Xi as well, right? And they're neighbors. And, the last thing I think that Putin wants is for China to become the next hegemon and for them to still be, not.
Yeah. Is that why you think the U.S. is more likely to align itself with Russia than with China, just because of that? They share a continent, essentially?
Partly. Yeah. Partly. And then, and so I think it's very possible that Putin is whispering in Xi's ears, telling him, this is your time. I think, you should really make a move. I think you could really take on the U.S. and then let that happen. And then, Putin can kind of sit back and pick up the pieces. And that wouldn't surprise me at all if something like that was going on. I think that the common wisdom, I think, is that the ascendancy of China is the expected reality, and that they will be the next global power. And I'm not sure that's the case. I don't think that China is as strong internally as they project to the rest of the world. Right. I think they have a lot more problems internally that they would like to admit. Yeah. I think it's the progress that they've made militarily and economically is over the last 40 years. It's incredible. Yeah. And I am in no way dismissing it. Yeah. But the idea that they could take on the U.S. in a war right now, I think is a little bit wrong. And people say, well, Brent, you're overconfident, and it's not that I'm over. First of all, I'm not. I don't want the. I'm not suggesting that the U.S. should be the global hegemon and should take over the world. I'm just saying you should never be overconfident. But what I find funny is when people say that, Brent, you're overconfident in what the U.S. can achieve militarily. And I guess my point back to them is, hold on a second. The U.S. is far and away the biggest and greatest military power in the history of the world. I mean, and it's really not even close. And again, I don't necessarily like it, but it just is. Yeah. But you're telling me that the U.S. But then people tell me the U.S. can't even win a war. We can't even win in Iraq. We can't win in Afghanistan. We can't win in Syria. And I'm sitting there saying, what makes you think we wanted to win in those places?
Right.
When you win, you have to come home. We don't want to come home.
No.
You know. And so the idea that I'm the one that's overconfident rather than the upstarts are going to knock off again the black hat.
Yeah.
To me, that's who's overconfident. Now, again, I'm not trying to be. I'm not. You know, the thing I get labeled as like an American exceptionalist. I think that we're so much better than everywhere else, and we're so much smarter, and nothing can. And that's not the case at all. I actually think that we've made a number of mistakes along the way, and I think that those mistakes are going to lead to our eventual demise, for lack of a better word. But I think there's stages that we have to go through to get there.
Yeah.
And I think I just don't think we're at that end stage yet.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I see maybe Japan had a similar perception about it in the 80s as China does today, roughly. That they're just, you know, up and coming, going to take over the world really quick. Like, I do want to throw in this topic though. So how do you see gold playing into all of this? I also had Dominic Frisby on, who's a monetary historian, and he was making the case that he thinks, you know, China is not only the largest producer of gold, but also the largest buyer of gold over the past several years. Yeah. And these are not public figures, but when he was kind of doing some back of the envelope calculation, he thought China had more like 14,000 tons of gold. Whereas here in the US, I think our official number is around 9,000, but we haven't had an audit of Fort Knox in 50 years. And there's a lot of concern around that. So do you think that is a major factor here? That if China, I guess, first of all, do you agree with that at all? That maybe they've accumulated more gold than they've let on? And if so, would they use that as a lever effectively to try and insert their digital yuan or whatever currency as the new global reserve currency?
So this is a great topic. I mean, I could talk about this topic for hours. So I've thought a lot about this, and I've done a lot of research on this, and I don't claim to have the answers, but I'll tell you what I think. So first of all, I think with regard to gold, just gold itself, I think gold is going to go much higher in the years ahead. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen tomorrow. I actually think it's possible. We've just seen the high for gold for the year in the last month. Now, again, if I'm wrong on that, that's totally fine. I'm not telling you that so that everybody goes out and sells their gold. Keep your gold. I'm just saying it might not pay off this year. And so if I'm wrong on that and gold goes higher, that's fine. But with regard to the US and gold and China and gold, I think all governments hold gold, or the ones that do hold gold, as an insurance policy. I think they know that despite their state-sponsored money, that the free market has over the centuries chosen gold as money. So that is one form of insurance that they hold should the belief in their fiat currencies fail, right? And for someone like China, I think having gold gives them a seat at the table, for lack of a better word. If and when this whole thing gets reset, having gold, I think Jim Rickard said it this way, and if somebody, but whoever said it, I do agree with this, is that it gives them a seat at the table when the next system is set up. Right. Because if they don't like whatever system is being set up, they'll say, fine, I'll just use my gold. And, gold is, in many ways still the ultimate form of payment. Now, maybe other things will be developed over time as well, but, as of right now, I think that's why they hold it. So I'm a big fan of gold, and I think everybody should own gold in their portfolio for those reasons. Now, with regard to how much does the U.S. have and what does China have, it would not surprise me to learn that China has these 14,000 tons of gold. I think they have it on their 3 officially or something like that, right? Yeah. And I think the U.S. officially is 9. And I've said this several times, and so this isn't the first time I've said this, but I've said several times that I think the U.S. has a lot more gold than we say we do as well. I don't know if it's in Fort Knox. I don't know if it's somewhere else, but my guess is that we have a lot more gold than we've ever said we have.
Sorry to interrupt, but why? What's the deal there? Governments are just incentivized to hide their holdings?
Well, I think no, I think it's actually the opposite. I think, if you hold something, it's like, why do they have Julian Assange in prison? Because he's dangerous. So they're holding him in a cell, right?
Right.
The reason they hold gold is because gold is dangerous. Gold is dangerous to their existence, right?
Yeah.
They don't, if gold is in the hands of the free market and the citizens, they can use that against their fiat money laws, right? Or their legal tender laws. And so they want to control it. And, and I think the central banks and the US in particular has done a great job of, quote unquote, demonetizing gold over the last 50 years, right? They've worked tirelessly to get it out of the system. Yeah. And I think one of the ways they do that is they get a hold of it. And it kind of serves two purposes. One, it gives them the insurance policy, and two, it gives them control of it. So, and again, this is pure speculation on my point. I have no research that says we have more than that, but I actually think we probably do have more than that.
Yeah. It's interesting.
I've actually got a question for you.
Okay, please.
So, if you don't mind, because I've listened. I'm not expert on all your views. I've heard you speak a number of times and interviews and presentations, and I know that you are. I guess is it fair to say you're libertarian leaning?
I've adopted this.
I don't want to put a label on you, but that's
no. I appreciate you asking. Labels. It's funny. I'm kind of in general don't believe in labels that much. I mean, I know we use them, but I try to be more of a thinker and an inquirer. Always, like what was Socrates? The only thing I know is I know nothing at all, as you said at the beginning of the show. The label I put on it is freedom maximalist. I think it would be a blend of anarcho-capitalist and libertarian. The one thing I don't see eye to eye with the libertarians on yet, and I'm reading Rothbard right now, a lot of his work, and trying to get my head around it, is this whole axiom of non-aggression. I mean, I just don't think, to your point earlier, it's not what we see in the real world. It's like if property can be aggressed on, it is aggressed on. You're never going to get people to adopt this universal morality that they won't do it. The best thing you can do is make property as unaggressible as possible. So, and that's why I have such great hope for Bitcoin. I think it's a property right that's independent of the monopoly on violence, and it's really hard to take from someone. If you custody it properly, it's really hard to steal. So long-winded answer.
Well, no,
I
so
say
that
freedom
actually
maximalist.
That kind of goes, you kind of started to touch on the question I had, because I guess my question to you is, I know you have positive feelings toward Bitcoin. I'm going to try not to put a label on this, but I know that you see great potential in Bitcoin.
Yes.
So I guess my question to you is, do you think that potential is actually going to be realized, or do you think that it's not going to be realized, but because you think it is such a willing project, you're willing to, in other words, it's something worth failing for or fighting for. Is that the right way to say it?
Well, definitely, as with all great revolutions in human history, you need a big why. And Bitcoin definitely has a very big why. It's like to end this tyranny of central banking or monopolization of money. But I wouldn't just, I hold basically all of my savings in Bitcoin. And it's not because I'm hopeful that it will succeed. I mean, I think it has from a very pragmatic standpoint, it's designed to do one thing. It's money wrapped in military grade encryption designed to survive. So it's, create a new block every 10 minutes, hard cap of 21 million, survive. And as you said earlier, that's the beauty of it almost, is this elegant simplicity it has, that it's stripped down. There's no real attack surface on it. It's already peaked above $1 trillion market cap. It's the most secure computing network in human history. And I think that very practically, it's the best risk-adjusted return opportunity in the world. And the $100 trillion question, if you will, is how do you stop it? How do you take it out? And I've been looking for the answer to that question for 5 years, almost exclusively, like always trying to, where am I wrong? Where am I wrong? I haven't heard a good counter argument formulated. I mean, the known unknown is the state response, which we've explored thoroughly today.
Yeah.
They can do lots of things to slow it down, but there's no way to turn it off, like to stop the network completely. So that leaves unknown unknowns. So it's like the only thing that anyone has conceived of, if you want to use that word, is a black swan event of some kind. So there's a global EMP or some technological black swan we can't foresee that takes it out. So in my mind, I'm like, okay, Bitcoin's optimized to survive. So long as it continues to survive, just doing what it's been doing flawlessly for 12 years, it continues to eat monetary premium, right? Especially against this macro backdrop of more inflation, more taxation. You're creating more demand for inflation resistance and tax avoidance, not evasion, avoidance. And so I see that similar dynamic playing out with the church, right? When the printing press was invented, first the church wrote it off, just like they wrote off Bitcoin. It was a joke. Don't need to worry about it. Whoop-de-doo. Then they see it threatening their monopoly on knowledge. They start to crack down on it. But when they cracked down on it, it actually drove the proliferation of the printing press. Like people were printing books on how to create printing presses, and it just proliferated throughout the world. The church collapsed. So I see that a similar dynamic playing out where as government tries to tighten its grip on people, more coercion, more compulsion, it's going to push people into, it's like a hydraulic press pushing people into inflation resistant money, right? Just as a means of survival. And so I just see it eating market cap in that way. Now I understand this is radical. I understand we've never had anything like it. And I guess below all of this is my bigger thesis on the digital age. I just think the digital age is radically transformative. It's going to, everything we think we know today is probably going to be out the window in 50 to 100 years. And I think Bitcoin is just kind of the tip of the spear on that.
Yeah, got it.
I would love to ask you one more question. I know we're right up against time.
Sure. Absolutely, no worries. Okay.
So you make the great point that governments need to lock up that which is dangerous, whether you're Julian Assange or you're gold. So by extension, I guess you could probably argue that Bitcoin's already a little bit dangerous, but should it continue to grow and become, call it an existential threat to central bank monopolies, do you think then governments will strive to, quote unquote, lock up Bitcoin? And if so, what does that look like?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And, I think largely, I don't, again, this is pure speculation. I don't have any evidence of this. And I am not completely convinced it wasn't a government sponsored project to begin with. Yep. I know there's been a lot of people that said no, it's not the case. And maybe it's not, but I'm not, I would never say that's impossible. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's the biggest beta test in history. I don't know. But or maybe the most successful beta test in history. Anyway, I think that, so initially it was going to be a currency and a way of an improvement upon fiat currency, right? And it had both a store of value component and a currency component, payment component. I think it's fair to say over the last couple of years, it's gone from being a payment component to a store of value. The store of value has been the greater argument for its existence and its ownership. Mm-hmm. Now, I think while so as a result, then people have said it's not a threat to the dollar and to other currencies because it's just going to be a form of collateral. I think there's some truth to that. That's actually not a bad argument. If everybody decides something is of value, it doesn't matter what it is. If everybody decides napkins are a store of value, they become a store. All value is ascribed, right? So if the whole world says napkins have value, they have value. So if the whole world, if everybody continues to believe in Bitcoin, then it will have value, and it could be this, digital form of collateral that, can sit on a balance sheet and provide liquidity, et cetera, et cetera. However, I think that by design, and I think if you read Satoshi's first paper and you read his thinking on the subject, it is by design political. It is designed to take away some of the power from government issued money, right? So if it continues to survive and it continues to thrive, like any government, it gets bigger and bigger. It's like a ratchet. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Very few people in history ever give away power. There's been a few, but it's extremely rare.
Right.
And governments typically don't do it. And I would be surprised if the Bitcoin community, or however you want to describe that, would want to give away power as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think the longer it's around, the longer it stays around, the more legitimate it becomes, right? The reason it's sticking around is because it has legitimacy. And I think the longer it sticks around, then I think the bigger threat it becomes. And, maybe it takes 4 months, maybe it takes 40 years, I don't know. But if Bitcoin sticks around and continues to grow, it will eventually come into conflict with the state. Now, I don't know if that happens at a price of 40,000 or a price of 400,000 or a price of 4 million, but it's somewhere along that scale, it becomes inherently in conflict with the state monopoly.
Yep.
And I just believe that people underestimate the lengths to which governments will go to keep their power.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they will win, but I'm saying there will be a battle.
Yeah.
And I am not willing to go all in on the bet that Bitcoin wins.
Right.
I'm fine owning some. I have nothing against people that own some. I have a little bit of trouble with the maximalists who encourage other people to sell everything they have and go borrow money and buy Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I think it's wholly irresponsible for a number of reasons, but everybody gets to make their own decisions. As an independent, Austrian thinking libertarian, it's your money. You can do whatever you want with. But if you're asking my opinion, I don't think it's wise.
Yeah, I agree and would like to go on record. I always try to just tell people to invest in knowledge, like go and study. That's where you get all of the benefits. And then as you've put in the work to structure a worldview, then make your portfolio construction consistent with that. I'm not here to tell people to go put all their money in Bitcoin. I mean, I have chosen to hold all of my savings in Bitcoin. That's what's a rational decision for me. That may not be for you. So please, all the legalese and all the disclaimers. Yeah.
All the disclaimers.
So just to press that last question a little bit further, what does it look like if they try to lock up Bitcoin? Does this mean, what does that even mean? First of all,
maybe it's as simple as they lock up you and me and other people who speak positively of it, or whoever does. Now, I know a lot of people will say, we'll just fight it. Well, I mean, again, history shows that most people don't fight it. Most people don't rise up against the government, right? Occasionally things get bad enough that they revolt. And even a lot of times the revolts get put down. Right?
Yeah.
But occasionally a revolution succeeds. Think of all the revolutions that you can name. The reason you can name them is because they're the ones that succeeded.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But there's not that many of them. Right? There's a few, but there's not that many of them.
It was an uprising, right? A revolution if it succeeds, an uprising if it fails.
Exactly. And so the reality is if you tell most people that if they do something, they're going to go to jail, most people aren't going to do it. Now there's some that are, but most of them aren't. And that's just if you tell them they're going to go to jail. If you start putting more threats on top of it, the beatings, you start beating a few people and you do it on television. Yeah. I mean, I'm being silly, but I'm also being serious. Like, again, today, if enough people in the United States right now decided that we didn't like the form of government that we have, the power lies with the people because the people always outnumber the government.
Right.
But the government has the bigger guns, right? Yeah. And so if you get big enough numbers to push back against the guns, you can overrun the guns.
Mm.
But the reality is most people back away. Most people don't run towards the guns. Most people run away from guns.
Right.
And I'm using a very kind of a silly analogy, but that's what history tells you. I think a lot of people like to envision themselves as William Wallace, but there's only a few William Wallaces that actually exist, right?
Yeah.
Very few people are willing to go to the mat under those circumstances.
Right.
And if everybody was William Wallace's, there wouldn't be countries. I mean, that's
right. Yeah.
we would have our libertarian utopian society, right? But the fact is most people don't do that.
Yeah. No, excellent points. I love the way you describe that if it's dangerous, governments want to lock it up. And I agree with you completely. And I guess in my mind, I think they're going to try to lock it up on their balance sheet. It becomes a game of accumulation. And then that's what, it's almost like states take our power.
Why couldn't they just buy all the Bitcoin, put it on their balance sheet, and then never use it, just like they did with gold?
Well, they can, but what is the market cap of Bitcoin at that point?
But if they're going to print the dollars for it, what do they care?
I mean, if they're trying to buy from certain hand, no, I agree with you, but it's like that's sort of that's destroying the monopoly in the process.
I'm being kind of facetious here, but I guess my point is I don't know what they will do or how they will do it. There's probably a lot more people, a lot more knowledgeable than me that can give you a number of reasons what they could do, and there's probably just as many people tell you why it would fail.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think if Bitcoin is going to be as successful as many people think it is going to involve a battle. And I believe that when that battle comes, the state will be able to inflict a lot of pain. Right. Perhaps the state will lose. I don't think the state will lose, but perhaps they will.
Gotcha.
And so that's kind of my intention of always, when I talk about Bitcoin, is just to say, hey, this is not a guaranteed outcome.
Yeah.
I know the Bitcoin maximalists will tell you that this is a guaranteed, inevitable outcome.
Right.
I don't think that is the case.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Nothing is inevitable. And the exciting thing about it is it's turned this Keynesian debate between Austrian and Keynesian economics into a market test. So I guess we'll see,
a little bit.
Which is interesting. Brent, this has been an awesome discussion. I'm really glad you got to come on. I'd love to have you back on, actually, because I feel like we could probably just talk about this stuff forever.
I'm always happy to talk. If I got time, I'm happy to talk.
I mean, macro just keeps getting more interesting with tech. Like tech and macro colliding is just I can't not get my mind around it all. So it's super exciting to talk to someone like yourself. Do you want to just maybe let people know where they can find you?
Sure. So I have a website. All that's on there is my address and my phone number and my email. So try not to blow it up too much. But if people have questions, just go to santiagocapital.com. I'm happy to try to answer any emails. I try to get to them all. I don't always succeed. So please don't be offended if I don't get back to you right away. And you can send me a second email if I don't respond to the first one. I'm pretty active on Twitter. You can search for me under Santiago Capital. My handle is Santiago AU Fund. And then if you go to YouTube and type in, my name and Santiago Capital, you'll get a number of links. And like I said, I'm happy to come back and talk with you anytime.
Awesome. Thank you, Brent. We'll throw that in the show notes. And honestly, man, great discussion. Just all the gears are turning. Like I've got this new angle to look at the world through Graeber a little bit. So I've got more homework to do.
All right. Good stuff, man.
All right.
Thanks,
Brent.
Have a good one. See you.
Bye.